some atheists use some really poor arguments. And these arguments only really take off because these atheists have some credentials, some scientific credentials. If a normal person was to make those sort of arguments, they would be ridiculed. They would never open their mouth again in terms of this topic, in terms of the topic of atheism and theism and, this sort of dialogue. Now, I was watching a video of Sean Carroll. Sean Carroll, again, is one of these atheists who has these credentials, so therefore he uses those credentials to make really nonsensical arguments. I hope you don't lose some brain cells watching this, but bear with me and watch this clip.
Darwin showed how material, matter all by itself, without guidance, without purpose, without an aim, just by the natural motion of ordinary things, can lead to the marvelous diversity of organic life that we see here on Earth. That was another huge step in the direction of naturalism. Now, of course, I could go on. We could talk about modern cosmology and the origin of the universe. We could talk about neuroscience and what consciousness is and so forth. But I don't want to do that right now. We can maybe talk about it later. But I don't want to do it right now basically because it's kind of boring. And the reason why it's kind of boring is because the argument is finished. The debate is over. We've come to a conclusion. Naturalism has won. If you go to any university physics department, listen to the talks they give or the papers they write. Go to any biology department, go to any neuroscience department, any philosophy department, people whose professional job it is to explain the world, to come up with explanatory frameworks that match what we see. No one mentions God. There's never an appeal to a supernatural realm by people whose job it is to explain what happens in the world. Everyone knows that the naturalist explanations are the ones that work.
So here he is making the claim, naturalism has won. Atheism's true, right? Because all over the world, when people are, they're doing biology, physics, maths, chemistry, whatever, they're not talking about God. Therefore, we won. That's a really silly argument. And it is so ridiculous that I'm not even going to challenge it using a theist. I'm going to use, actually, an atheist. In fact, an atheist who's part of the new atheist movement. Now, what Sean Carroll has done here, which is a mistake, is he has conflated methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism. And he's in good company because people like Richard Dawkins, they also make this mistake. However, the philosopher Massimo Pigliucci, I hope I said his name right, although he's part of the new atheist movement, although he himself is a naturalist, he points out the fallacy of this argument. This is what he says. The fallacy lies in the fact that most people, including prominent science popularizers such as Richard Dawkins, do not make the subtle but crucial distinction between methodological and philosophical naturalism. Naturalism, broadly speaking, is the idea that there is only nature and that the supernatural realm and phenomena do not exist. As a philosophical position, it has a long history of elaboration and debate. Philosophical naturalism, then, is the strong metaphysical position that there is, as a matter of fact, no such thing as the supernatural nor a higher being, which obviously characterizes any individual who considers themselves an atheist. Methodological naturalism, however, is a metaphysically more modest claim. It takes the position that while there may be a supernatural realm or being, it does not enter and need to be invoked in any discussions of scientific findings. So, if you imagine, there he is, he's back again. So if you imagine you walk into a house, right? And there's a bit of a weirdo who owns the house, and the weirdo's like, right, you guys are not allowed to wear the color red. No one is allowed to wear the color red. He has no color red in the house. And whoever comes to his house, say he throws a party, everyone enters and they are not wearing the color red because this guy says there's no red. And it has a sign on the door which says no red allowed. Imagine late at night after they've ate and dined and whatnot, they sit down and this guy basically says to them, guys, the color red does not exist. Everyone's going to look around at each other in a very weird way and try and find an excuse to leave the party. Why is that? Because he is the one who set the rule saying no red allowed. You can't walk in here and wear the color red. Then based upon that axiom that you can't let any red in or red is not allowed here, then how can you conclude red does not exist? How can you confuse the rule that you have at the door with the conclusion that red does not exist? That's obviously fallacious. The same thing is true in science. When you enter a scientific lab, when you enter a scientific discourse, you are not allowed to speak about anything supernatural. You're not allowed to speak about God or the soul or the immaterial mind or objective morals existing out in the world. You cannot speak about these things because that is the rule of methodological naturalism. Now, whether that rule is correct or not, we can get into that later. Firstly, that rule did not exist throughout the 1,000 years of history of science. It is a very recent phenomenon. It's only really been around since the late Victorian period, since after the publication of The Origin of Species. So this rule, you cannot walk into a scientific lab and say, hey, look, the physics guy, the biology guy, the chemistry guy, the anthropology guy, the sociology guy, all these people, they are not referring to God, therefore God doesn't exist. That is circular reasoning, because that's the very assumption that you walked into. So thankfully, philosophers, thank God, atheist philosophers like Massimo Pigliucci exist, who are willing to say, guys, look, I am an atheist, but I recognize you guys are using a fallacy. You are not making the distinction between methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. So sorry, Sean Carroll, that argument is not going to float. Just because all the physics and chemistry and biology across the world, all those departments are not mentioning God in their peer-reviewed journals, does not mean God does not exist, because that's simply the rule of methodological naturalism. Now, a little bit more about this particular idea, because this idea of methodological naturalism, this is of course misused by atheists, but also we need to speak about a few relationships here. So you have methodological naturalism and you have philosophical naturalism. Now, does methodological naturalism lead to philosophical naturalism? The answer is no. Logically, you can be somebody who accepts methodological naturalism as a system of doing science, but outside of the scientific discourse, you do believe in God. And this is explained in a very good way by the evolutionary biologist Scott Todd. And this is what he says. Even if all the data points to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Of course, the scientist, as an individual, is free to embrace a reality that transcends naturalism. Thankfully, he does recognize you can be somebody who believes in methodological naturalism, but outside of that, it doesn't mean you have to be a philosophical naturalist. So it's clear that methodological naturalism doesn't lead to philosophical naturalism. However, does methodological naturalism psychologically lead to philosophical naturalism? I think the answer to that is yes. Why? Because you have fools like Sean Carroll, who go around saying, hey, look, scientists aren't really talking about God, therefore there's no God. And most people, they are not going to study the philosophy of science. They're not going to know about these things. So they're just going to be, wow, that's so true. They're not talking about God, therefore there must not be a God. So now let's go back to this distinction, methodological naturalism, philosophical naturalism. Clearly, logically, this doesn't lead to this. Methodological naturalism doesn't lead to philosophical naturalism. Emotionally, psychologically, socially, it does. And that's obviously a problem. Now let's look at it the other way. Does philosophical naturalism lead to methodological naturalism? If you're a philosophical naturalist, are you more likely to support methodological naturalism as a system in science, or are you likely to challenge it? Of course, the answer is that you would love it. If you're a philosophical naturalist, if you believe out there in nature there is no color red, then of course if you walk into a house in which it says there is no red, you're going to be more than happy with that. So methodological naturalism doesn't lead to philosophical naturalism, but philosophical naturalism does entail methodological naturalism. Now, these distinctions are important because atheists, they pretend as if these don't exist. And as Pigliucci pointed out, this obviously leads to the impression that science entails atheism, when science does not entail atheism. And what we need to take away is that this argument about whether methodological naturalism is a valid assumption in science is fundamentally dependent upon whether naturalism, philosophical naturalism, is true or theism is true. And at the moment, the best arguments about this particular topic that are actually made are the fallacious arguments that since scientists aren't talking about it, therefore it must be true. Or because science is working under these assumptions and is still producing results, therefore philosophical naturalism must be true. There's a big problem with that, because for the majority of science's history in the last 1,000 years, from the time of Ibn Haytham all the way to the 1890s or whatever, it had the assumption not of methodological naturalism, but of theism. God was invoked. We had this universal, monotheism, this idea that God prevails over all of creation. And it didn't conflict with science, because science is an attempt to explain how the world works, not an attempt to explain why anything exists in the first place, the existential questions, the metaphysical questions. So we don't have a problem with how the world works. And for us, the belief in God and the belief in science is a how and why distinction. So we don't really see them as a contradiction. And what we also need to understand is that philosophical naturalism is not fundamentally a proven idea. It is an act of faith. One of the most important philosophers of science alive today, one of the most important, in fact, Darwinian academics, who's probably written more books on Darwinism than definitely Richard Dawkins, but most other academics. That is the atheist philosopher Michael Ruse. And he admits about philosophical naturalism that it is actually an act of faith. This is what he says. So you can't just say philosophical naturalism is proven, or philosophical naturalism is something that we know to be true. That is not the case. In fact, they are recalcitrant facts which resist the theory when it comes to philosophical naturalism, such as the beginning of the universe, or design in the universe, objective morality, consciousness, the origin of language. There are many things which directly challenge philosophical naturalism. But because methodological naturalism is is applied within evolutionary biology, there are some conclusions which are inescapable because of that. And one of those conclusions is anything, no matter how well designed it looks, it is not designed. And this isn't a hidden secret. It's not like there's a conclusion in evolutionary biology that design is an illusion. No, it is an assumption because of methodological naturalism, because you can't refer to God's creative power. All biological design is designed by natural selection, is natural. This is the way the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Francis Crick explains it. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see evolved. It wasn't designed. Another way that Richard Lewontin, who is a Harvard professor, also an atheist, explains it is this. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So Sean Carroll's poor argument that naturalism has won is fundamentally the same pathetic argument which Dawkins and others have been using, and it is based upon a fallacy, a crucial distinction which they do not make. Imagine if a Christian went up to Richard Dawkins and said, I believe in the Bible. And he's like, ha ha ha, you believe in the Bible. Why do you believe in the Bible? He says, because the Bible is from God. Dawkins says, why do you believe it's from God? Because the Bible says so. Well, Dawkins would rightly point out that's circular reasoning. If someone asks you, why do you believe the Bible is from God? And you say, because the Bible says it's from God, that's circular reasoning. Why don't you guys realize you too are doing the same mistake? You're basically saying naturalism is true. Why? Because naturalism works. When the hidden assumption there is that's the rules you have actually set in science. So of course, that's what scientists are going to use. You can't use that as proof that naturalism is true. That is actually circular reasoning. And the only thing that keeps these ideas afloat, and they're still popular, is the fact that people like Sean Carroll have a PhD. But the problem is, you know, when you take drugs, it messes with your brain. These guys, as intelligent as they are, the commitment to atheism, commitment to materialism, the commitment to naturalism, this is like drugs. It just screws up the wires in their brain. So when it comes to their particular fields of physics or whatever particular thing they're dealing with, they can come up with really intelligent ideas. But when it comes to actually dealing with philosophical ideas, deep ideas, because they want to justify atheism, by hook or crook, they will use an argument. Even if, and I do believe some atheists do this, not all, not brushing all of them aside. I do believe they deliberately use poor arguments because they're trying to get a point across. And inshallah, God willing, in future videos, I'm going to be giving examples of where atheists deliberately, atheist scientists deliberately mislead the public to lead them towards atheism. But in a world such as what God has created, you will always have people that speak up for the truth, and they will always have people who speak up for the falsehood. But as it says in the Quran, truth smashes falsehood. And when truth smashes falsehood, falsehood is bound to vanish.